20th century is the century of collecting and shared collecting for investment. So you have multiple owners at different times of these very expensive objects that are being bought out of auction. So it is very complex. And when you're dealing with the media today, you have 5 seconds to explain your story.
Hi everybody, my name is Doug Barr, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Saint Helena Forum for Innovation and Creativity. The Forum, as most of you know, is an educational nonprofit with a mission to entertain, inform, and inspire by presenting a broad mix of humanities-based programming. Our guest today is Jane Milosch. She's the founding director of the Smithsonian's Provenance Research Initiative in the Office of the Undersecretary for History, Art and Culture, overseeing World War II-era provenance research and advising on international cultural heritage projects, provenance, and training programs. Milosch directed pan-institutional art programs and led new interdisciplinary initiatives and strategic planning efforts at the Smithsonian's 8 art units. She completed the Getty Museum's Leadership Institute, was a curator at the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art in Iowa, and the Detroit Institute of the Arts. As a Fulbright Scholar in Munich, she was managing editor for Prestel Art Books and a consultant to art museums, galleries, and other cultural institutions. Most recently, Jane was a visiting professorial fellow teaching provenance and curatorial studies at the University of Glasgow. Jane will be in conversation today with her colleague in the museum world and a member of the Forum's advisory board, Peggy Loar. Peggy is a museum professional with a global experience in museum planning and program development, museum architecture and design, and museum leadership. She's the founding director of the new National Museum of Qatar in Doha and has also worked as the interim vice president for global affairs and culture and director of the Asia Society Museum in New York City. She served as the interim president and director of the Corcoran Gallery of Art and College of Art and Design in Washington, D.C., facilitating the merger with the National Gallery of Art and the George Washington University, my alma mater. She is the founding president and director of 2 American institutions, the Wolfsonian Museum and Research Center at Florida International University, and COPIA, the American Center for Wine, Food, and the Arts in Napa, where she was later named President Emerita. In her early career, Peggy was director of the Smithsonian Institution's Traveling Exhibition Service for 9 years, where she developed over 100 exhibitions for annual circulation, national and internationally, and was awarded the Smithsonian Gold Medal for Distinguished Service, previously given to only 8 individuals in the whole history of the institution. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Milosch and Peggy Loar.
Thank you, Doug, for that warm introduction, and hello, Jane. I join the Forum's president, Doug Barr, in welcoming you and our audience to this Forum dialogue. I'd also like to offer some opening remarks to help set the stage for our audience as to what we'll cover today. Looting and plundering of other civilizations have been characteristic of war since our bellicose human nature was recorded. Some of the most well-known objects we're familiar with include the Rosetta Stone, which was shipped to London in 1802, having been taken from the French after their Egyptian defeat. Then the Elgin marbles, also shipped in 1802 to Britain from the Parthenon in Greece, with Greece trying for decades to recover them from the British Museum. And now Athens, of course, has a beautiful Parthenon museum, but they have replicas. They're waiting for the originals. And in 1825, fragments from Persepolis in Persia, which is now Iran, headed west to Berlin, having been taken by the Germans. It was definitely a period of imperialism and colonialism. So we're going to focus on repatriation today and the laws designed to address who owns and who should own what. A bit of sleuthing turned up an early Antiquities Act of 1906 in the U.S. It seems to have been the first law to protect archaeology sites on public lands, but nothing addressed the worldwide problem until the UNESCO Treaty of 1970 that Jane will tell us about and correct me if there is more to know about any legislation between 1906 and 1970. We have the more recent Washington Principles of 1998 and the best practices issued by the U.S. State Department this past March, which address repatriation to the descendants of those whose works were stolen by the Nazis. Our guest has had a lot of experience in this realm. We'll hear about that. We have also the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is called NAGPRA, and it's of 1990. It was revised just last year in 2023, and it addresses the return of human remains as well as cultural objects. There's so much to cover. Asia, especially Cambodia and Thailand, the unresolved Nazi-era repatriation to the legal descendants of Holocaust victims. There's Africa, Senegal, and the Kingdom of Benin, which is now Nigeria, plundered of precious ceremonial objects and the amazing Benin bronzes of taken in 1897. And we also have early Greco-Roman artifacts, especially those that have passed through numerous museums and unscrupulous galleries and dealers, many in New York City. We are now experiencing firsthand the changes, ethical concerns, and collections repatriation our museums are undergoing. It's cast a shadow, not only over them, but on auction houses, collectors, art dealers, even some scholars. Museums today are complex organizations. They have a deep focus on new technology, getting multiculturalism and ethics right, engaging with society and their communities, and dealing with the politics of opinion. And despite our difficult theme today, they remain some of our most trusted institutions. It's just that running them these days is not so easy. Conversations around repatriation for stolen art being returned to its country of origin have finally moved into the mainstream, as evidenced by press activity, and a lot of it, and our dialogue today. So we are left with the following questions. One, what is the right thing to do, which increasingly is the legal thing we must do? And two, where does it all stop? In other words, will repatriation do damage to the breadth and reach of museum collections around the world? Because repatriation is happening around the world. Jane, I know you are the person who can explain all of this to us and what it means for the future of museums and our tangible world history. Let's start with how museums tend to react when asked by a country to return their looted property. Would you give us a kind of brief overview of the process and where we are right now before we dive into how important new research has become, the ethical principles involved, and the messy legal aspects?
Sure. Well, I think what's not known to a lot of the general visitors to a museum is that museums, especially I can speak to the United States, we have professional organizations that from the very beginning decide whether or not we're going to be accredited. So there's a set of guidelines for collecting policies, when we acquire, how we acquire things, how we document them, how we share and care for them, how we even interpret them. They give us guidelines. So the challenging part is also in the United States, most museums are private. They're not like the rest of the world that are connected to a government organization. So therefore, that's why the Professional Association of the Association of Art Museum Directors, when it comes to art, is even more specifically addressing these kinds of questions. If someone thinks that we are holding an object that we do not hold legal title to and should be investigated. Because I was at the Smithsonian for 15 years, I have to say I was very fortunate because it is the one big federal institution. We always say our collections are your collections. We are the stewards of the collections. So I'm very proud that I worked for an organization where its history from the very beginning was very focused on that. It's not to say that things didn't come into the collection without with a perfectly clear provenance. I think another thing most people don't know is there are more gaps than not in terms of provenance research. So when the Smithsonian was founded, it was largely a scientific organization. So a lot of research and specimen collecting was happening. And so as the museum's collecting policy shaped and formed, it meant that a lot of gifts came in from all over different places where we weren't able always to identify the provenance and the attribution of everything. So because the Smithsonian, it was 19 museums last I left. I think it's up to 22 now. I'm not really sure. that each of those institutions have their own specific collecting policy related to what material is in that museum. I will say all of the Smithsonian museums have some art involved and cultural and historical objects that are related to those collections. But we also have a central office called Government Affairs and also a legal department. So if someone contacts one of our museums, I will say we take it very seriously. And usually we look at that, we look at the object, but before we even go that, we start a conversation with them. But also we bring in our legal team so we can also understand, because often more than not, and I can say during the 10 years I ran the Holocaust era provenance, I only had 2 claims. So there are far fewer claims than people think, because they're not publicized. They don't go to the next level. We resolve them one-on-one discreetly with those collectors. But when it does happen, and I can share an example later on, we begin a conversation where we openly share the research we have and the other side. The complication really is the legal side, which is why we bring them in, because it's turned into that ambulance chasing opportunity for a lot of people to make a lot of money and get a lot of people's hopes up high, very high, that they're going to find things that they're never going to be able to find. So there are many guidelines and processes in places when anyone thinks that a museum is holding an object that could potentially belong to them, their family, or the country of origin, to start that process of examining that claim.
You know, Jane, in your writings and your books, you have defined the term provenance, and I want to make sure that our audience understands that. So you have said it's the history of an object's ownership from the time of creation to the present. So my question is, how are we doing this research? Are we using AI like everybody else who's messing up our cell phones? What is the percentage of museums that hold complete records, and what's in the files, given that an unbroken line of ownership is hard to come by?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Well, I think that's the other thing that's changed over time, and why this all took off was with the whole ability to digitize collections. So in the 1990s, it was possible for people to share documentation, finding aids to archival research. So, but museums keep collection records for what they have both in the registrar's office, which is the office that registers the object when it comes in, and we're supposed to be doing our due diligence to make sure we have clear title. And then there's the curatorial side as well, who brings in their special expertise for whatever that object is to find it. Yeah, I like to think of it as object biographies, and I think it's something that I think we haven't been sharing enough of that with the public, and that's why it kind of came as a shock to a lot of people that there's so many uncertain provenances or provenances with gaps. And I always like to say I'd rather see them stay in museums than disappear into private collections, unless we're sure or find out ways to share these objects and advance until we have more information or research. But initially, when I started, it involved climbing around archives, going to Germany, a lot of archival research, a lot of very meticulous research. It's really documenting every possible transaction that occurred with that object from the time, as you said, its creation till its present time. And it doesn't.
So for instance, the files would contain dealer records and auction records.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. But the problem happens, of course, you only know what you know at the time. So with the digitization of documentation, there's been a flood of information that's come in that's allowed us, for example, with the Holocaust era, to be able to identify things that we couldn't identify before. But that information is always changing too. So I'll share an example. I worked most closely in launching our program with the Freer-Sackler Gallery, which has a huge collection of Asian art objects from all eras. And the curators of the 1930s, for example, in 34, when a Chinese gui came into the collection, it was purchased from a gallery in New York, C.T. Liu, a very famous gallery. And at the time, the gallery told the curator that the object had come directly from China to New York. And he didn't take that as his word. And he thought, that's strange. This is a very important object. I can't believe it didn't wasn't in Europe somewhere, because that was a period in which there was more collecting of Asian objects in Germany than any other country. And so he suspected it could have been in Berlin. But at the time, he couldn't access a lot of information because of the period, did the best due diligence he could. It's pretty, and he even documented the inscription. And also, and because we both are decorative arts historians, some of these decorative art objects like menorahs or like this gway, they can be taken apart and inscriptions changed out. A lot of objects, and that's also what facilitates and makes it difficult to be certain what you have. Every little piece is part of that. So yeah, we have extensive records, but we do also rely on auction houses and galleries, which can be problematic. It's gotten better, and there are some who are really stepping up and have been stepping up for a long time to provide documentation.
Okay, so let's move on to Nazi repatriation, which I think you've spent a lot of time with. I want to ask you about the 1970 UNESCO treaty and the Nazi provenance internet portal, along with the several other museums that you're working with for Nazi repatriation. Because in your writings and speaking, you've talked about the work of a kind of consortium, the idea that you and other museums and organizations don't work in isolation, but you collaborate and you try to help each other. And even inside museums, curators and registrars are working together to resolve these problems. So can you tell us a little bit about this? And is the portal the work of both U.S. and international museums?
Well, actually, that's a very good question. And I'm not sure, I had a lot of footnotes in that book. What you're referring to is NEPIP, the Nazi Era International Provenance Portal. When I started this project in 2009, it was 2009. Actually, it was 2008. I was doing other things. I quickly realized the technology was so out of date because it required each museum to constantly send in any updates on that object. This was not transferable, shareable. No, it was completely isolated. And so even within the Smithsonian, we had started our own Nazi era provenance research portal. This predated me. We had a fabulous person, Margaret, I'll think of her name. She's now at the National Gallery. Fantastic work with the Hirshhorn. But even between the Hirshhorn's collection database and ours, this information was not automatically updating. So I started a push for what I call centralizing, decentralizing, and centralizing information, which became very critical so that I think a lot of people don't know this, but most collections weren't even beginning to be digitized until the 1990s. And in terms of the Smithsonian, when I was there in 2008, we were just starting to do that. And so for a lot of curators and traditional researchers, they're not used to even doing their research online like that. That's not what they do. They go to a gallery, they go to an auction house, or they go to the library to get the catalogs and so forth. So that database to me was very obsolete, and they had a person who was running it. He left. And so we're still required, museums are still supposed to send in their information. We put up the first 400 Asian art objects from the Freer-Sackler's collection between the guidelines. Peggy didn't mention the guidelines, but any object that could have potentially been looted or stolen or translocated before 1932 to 1946. So really 1933 to 1945, anything that was made before then and could have been in Europe between that 33 and 45 is considered suspect. So that's a huge group of objects. Yeah. And yeah.
During 1942 and 44, approximately, as I understand it, 70,000 homes belonging to Jews in the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and many more, if you include Germany, were systematically looted after their inhabitants were deported to death camps. Regarding Holocaust restitution, can you mention some of the current cases on behalf of prominent Jewish families that lost both their lives and their collections? I know, for instance, that the Emil Berle collection has long been under suspicion for their impressionist works. They've got Monet, Courbet, Lautrec, Van Gogh, Gauguin. The foundation loaned the works to the Kunstmuseum in Zurich, but the collection is named after the German-born arms dealer who made his fortune during World War II by making and selling weapons to the Nazis. How did he acquire these masterpieces? And can you tell us about either this case or others that you wish to?
Yeah, I can't go into the specifics of the Burla collection, but I can tell you that even as a private museum, they were very aware of their history, because it was a very known history. It is new to a lot of Americans, I suppose, but not there. So they hired a very top level World War II era provenance researcher to deal with that material and also deal with their African collections as well. Um, in terms of recent there's so many. I mean, I don't even know where to start, to tell you the truth, in terms of what, um, I guess I kind of want to go back to the Freer Sackler and that Gui, the Chinese bronze ceremonial vessel, because I think it really is a telling story for anyone who's not aware of it. So this curator who acquired it in 34 here, I enter the Smithsonian. We had one of the leading scholars of decorative arts, 20th century German decorative arts, but also provenance research. Laurie Stein was hired to do a research. You probably know her, Peggy, of the Freer Sackler's collection. And we realized that the story about the Gui needed to be made public, and it would be an opportunity for us to launch our program. And we had made an agreement. Well, let me back up. So the claimer entered the museum before me. It went to the lawyers. The Smithsonian did its research. The other side provided its research, and it was determined that it did belong to the Oppenheimer family. And so a deal was offered to that. The Oppenheimer said they'd be fine to have us keep the object. So we purchased the object from the family. Nobody knew about it. No press release. Nothing at the time. This was in the early 2000s, and about early, maybe it's 2004, and so pre my arrival. So when we started this, we approached the Oppenheimer family saying, can we announce how we amicably resolved this solution, that the Gui is still in here? We're telling the story. We want to share the story of your family. We want to share this. And they said, yeah. So that's allowed us to do this press release. Well, as time goes on, there's more evidence that came out about that object. So we kept the object. It's on view. And then it was the idea that it came from a forced sale in Berlin. That's what all the documentation pointed to. Then a researcher at a Hamburg museum discovered that actually the sale in which that happened was not a forced sale, a closure by a bank and assets. So they made a separate decision from an object that came out of that sale. I make that example so you see we actually acted in good faith. To the claim, we kept the object, paid the family, and kept silent about it as they requested, and we appreciated their collaboration. And now, years later, it's become even more complicated as to whether or not that was a forced sale, and a forced sale was one when, as you said, these assets for the Jewish families and Jewish companies were seized. Even more complicated that I don't think people know is 20th century is the century of collecting and shared collecting for investment. So you have multiple owners at different times of these very expensive objects that are being bought out of auction. So it is very complex. And when you're dealing with the media today, you have 5 seconds to explain your story. And I'm not very good at that. I'm obviously interested in the complexity and communicating that, because we live in an age of fragmentation. And I think that's the role museums can play even more, is how do we share these stories?
I do think the media has been too interested in the dirt and than in the work that museums are doing to try and fix this situation. But it's been said that the U.S. needs a special commission to address Holocaust restitution. Can you explain what such a commission would do and why it's needed? And while you're at it, talk a little bit about the Washington principles and the best practices which help in this regard.
Well, I guess, the Washington Principles came out at a very important time. Again, at first, it started actually with the Association of Art Museum Directors. Philippe Montebello from the Met and Jim Wooloo from the Worcester Art Museum realized that with all the investigation that was going on with Swiss bank accounts first. So first came the bank accounts, first came the big money, and then came art and land assets. In terms of restitution and discovery. So they formulated a set of guidelines that they thought should happen. And then a presidential commission was formed in Washington called the Presidential Advisory for the Commission on Holocaust Assets in the United States. Lynn Nicholas, who's one of the authors of Rape of Europa, someone who broke the story, I would say, really still a great book. They came up with the guidelines and principles that I was outlining, that museums needed to go in, follow these things, put them up online, and record any object that had that gap. It had to be made public. The information had to be made public. Now I lost my train of thought, Peggy. What was the question?
Well, that's all right. It was about the Washington principles and the best practices, which are going to help us figure all this out.
Yeah, no, and you asked about a governmental commission. So at the time, there was talk of a governmental commission, but museum directors assured people, and they were also part of that whole process, we will self-police. We will do it. And I don't think people give us enough credit. So I will say that when I started, there was talk again when the 10-year anniversary of the Washington Principles came up. And there was, of course, things had changed since then. Now we have all these other countries who are part of the picture that were not before. And all that I could see was what was happening in Europe, where the governments were getting over involved. And that was not speeding things up. It was simply slowing things down. So the money was not going towards the research or training the people to do the research. It was going towards running the organization. And Germany tried to correct that. So I have to honestly say, I've always advocated against it, because I believe sometimes it leads to grandstanding. However, I think the Smithsonian was trying to do that. I mean, under my working for the Undersecretary for History, Art, and Culture, Richard Kern, who's now the Ambassador at Large, we performed that role. We were following UNESCO before it was even fully ratified and agreed, at all levels. So
it's sort of like in the area of, if it's not broken, don't fix it. I sort of get that. I mean, I think the self-policing of the directors museums are learning a lot about this issue, and everybody on the staff is, and a lot of it is confidential. I think we recognize that. But let me go to a general question that our audience is likely has on their mind. Okay. How do we handle that often asked question that without illegal pilfering or theft or looting, many of the objects wouldn't still exist today,
right,
or be cared for? This has long been the argument with the Elgin marbles. And I know, for instance, that Cambodia and Nigeria are trying to build new museums to house their repatriated artifacts. Right. I don't know how far they've gotten. But also, it's no secret that West Africa has thousands of objects held in their collections of what's it called? Their National Commission for Museums and Monuments. Yeah. And there seem to be few temperature controls there. And it's said that the staff is not well trained. Obviously, there's a resource problem. Is this the kind of environment into which museums return treasures? And what are your thoughts about the ability of these countries to care for their amazing art and culture?
Yeah, no, you raise a good question. I mean, I think these are the things we talk about at the University of Glasgow in our graduate programs, because we have to come up with new ways of collaborating between further museums that are further developed and trained staffs, and how we can share expertise in training and caring and policies, and that we can exchange and share long-term loans, so to speak. But yeah, I have to say again, African art at the Smithsonian early on recognized that that these objects they were stewards of it, not custodians. So they had already begun conversations in Nigeria and Ghana and other places to help train their museum staff, help build them, how already exchanging objects and loans, and even returning objects. So none of this was public per se, but it was just going on per force. And I think I remember at the College Art Association meeting where a number of African art historians were there, and they were divided because, some of these universities were just establishing what we see as art history. Art history is a discipline. I mean, remember, art history used to be a part of classics. It wasn't its own discipline until Wolfson came along. We're not 19th century when it really formed also with the history of collecting in museums. But anyways, half was divided. One said, give us back our artifacts. And I liked the other half's attitude was, we have what we have. We want a Renoir. We want a Monet. Can you loan, like, no, I mean, in the sense, like, help us tell a broader story or what was going on when this history in this moment, when things were looted here. So a more complex view of collaboration and exchange. Yeah, I mean, with Nigeria, that, the Benin bronzes, that's a big challenge because, yeah, I mean, I think the German government was overly optimistic and simply not realistic. And often governments don't listen to their experts. And that's what I saw happening in Germany initially was the intentions were all very good and their own art historians are doing top-notch work, but they were not getting the support they needed. And their voice, because someone decides, okay, we're going to just make sure 20 restitutions happen rather than, let's assess where we can start making a difference and have a long-term plan. And I think Germany has actually been a great example. I'm just not so keen on, and I'm not an expert in the return of colonial objects, but I will say we had a symposium with some of the leading academics who started this, and they all agreed that unless we're sure, in a museum is probably the best place and keep that dialogue going, well, look how long the Elgin marbles, now I think, I think they should go back. That beautiful museum, why not? I mean, why not? I'm not at the British Museum, but I think that at least that wave has changed where people recognize it's a good thing. So yeah, it's well, but not even Nigeria or Cambodia or India. What about in the U.S. where museums are financially not able to sustain themselves? They overbuilt. Are they caring for their collections? What's happened? It's become the entertainment industry has taken over, and that's why the research was declined. So I'll just.
There's just so many things being repatriated. Here in the U.S., museums have been active in returning these objects to their origin country. LACMA, for instance, repatriated some 20 objects to Australia, to the Warramunga people. They've returned Cambodian pieces. The Denver Art Museum recently returned 11 objects that passed through Douglas Latchford's hands. We'll talk about him in a moment. The Met has been dealing with repatriation issues for a very long time. And they recently hired the person who was previously handling provenance at Sotheby's. You probably know him. But sadly, it's been said that over 1,000 artifacts in the Met collections are linked to looting or trafficking. Now, you may not be able to talk about this in that this is one of our premier institutions. It would be nice to know, though, how they're handling this. So,
well, I only have great things to say about the Met, I have to tell you, because that was one of our closest partners from the beginning. Because like the Smithsonian, they have a history and resources that go deep and the roots are in research, whether it's all out there all the time. I mean, there was a rapid periods of collecting. I really give my hats off to the new director, Viennese guy. Why can't I think of his name right now?
He'll be in San Francisco near me. I can't either.
I'll come up with it. My goodness. Anyways, they have a very active provenance site, and I think they have been returning things. I think Dan Weiss, who was the also acting director there for a long time. I mean, they've poured even more money into it. But I'll tell you, even when I was there, I was so impressed with what they were doing. Getty Research Institute, also stellar marks because of their digitization and access and funding to make this possible. But I am worried even for the U.S. museums. But there are so many great examples. Denver, as you said, I have to say, Christoph, what's Christoph's last name? We went to art history together in Munich back in the 80s. Anyways, Denver was ahead returning things before it was even asked. It's so proactive, and actually even in Native American things. And I know Rick West, who helped build the American Indian Museum and at the Smithsonian, I was so glad he did an editorial pushing back on the bad journalism and distorted facts, saying, as a matter of fact, that's not true. And I think maybe this isn't the point, but there's also been this unevenness of people using this topic as grandstanding, promoting themselves. Like, oh, museums need to do research. not just under times of bad PR, but all the time. I'm like, who are you? I mean, like, I don't walk into a nuclear power plant and tell them how to run it and how they haven't been running it. I think people don't, I mean, the professionalization of our staff has to continue, but we've gone from the non-digital age to the digital age. And so that's why these international exchanges and collaborations are key, because they can be done in person and virtual. And that was the
Well,
thrust of our work.
it's just that this requires such a vast amount of research and requires serious resources for these museums. And I know the Met. I don't know if they've done this before or already, but they're sending 16 additional Keimer works that were linked to Douglas Latchford back to Cambodia.
Yeah.
And Douglas was the dealer and smuggler who knowingly took things from looters of sacred temple sites throughout Cambodia.
Yeah.
Do you know, and are you able to say where this stands? Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe you don't know about Cambodia.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. But I will say again, I think that's the great thing. The Met is very transparent about what they're doing. Well, and I think the hiring of Lucian Simmons, who's the head of, that was a big step forward. But also they added 3 more provenance researchers. And also all of the curators themselves work closely with the provenance researchers. So, yeah, I can't specifically answer to that, but I will say when it came to Australia, they also fell victim to some of those objects, and that forced them to also create their own cultural policy and expand their Asian art provenance research, and also funding the digitization of archives in these countries which didn't have the resources to do it. I think that's another thing where money goes further.
Well, I want to focus for one more moment on Douglas Latchford, because he had a collaborator. This is what museums go through. This is really a horrible situation with Denver. Latchford had a collaborator on the board of the Denver Art Museum, a scholar and dealer. I think her name was Emma Bunker. And they're both deceased now, so I feel like I can talk about it. But they worked together and used the Denver Art Museum as a kind of a way station for these stolen objects that Latchford would ship. And the museum returned everything to Bunker that she had given, removed her name from the gallery, returned the objects, and returned her donations that were close to $200,000. But was it after the 1970 UNESCO treaty that Latchford and others started faking export licenses to bring artifacts into the U.S.?
Oh, yeah, that I know that's been going on for a long time. Sadly, I mean, no, definitely. I think that's where the law enforcement people become very important in helping us track those down. But yes,
we weren't really following that in the 70s and 80s so much, were we? I mean, it just picked up in the 80s, I think.
Yes, no, it did, because people's ability to falsify them. But then in the digital age, it's become even easier, quite frankly. So where you can actually insert information, delete information, which is why I'm really the provenance of provenance is my other big topic of, like, what's the source of your data? Where is that information coming from is key. Yeah. So.
I want to mention for our audience that if anyone is interested in the subject of looting, you can find it on YouTube. It's a podcast on Douglas Latchford. It's called Dynamite Doug, and you will learn a lot of other things about curatorial research methods. And one of them is to find the feet on the temple from which the body has been separated. And this is happening now. We're finding it, and these are many of the objects that are going back to Cambodia. But repatriation is happening around the world. I mean, Denmark recently repatriated a sacred cloak to Brazil. The Vatican collections have Canadian indigenous artifacts that Trudeau has called on the Pope to return. And the Netherlands has returned 288 items looted during the colonial era from Indonesia, along with 3 objects looted from ancient Egyptian graves. It just seems like this is just so vast. So are these the kinds of returns generally initiated by the country that wants them back? Is New York, we're going to talk about New York in a moment, and Bogdanos, but are they helping the foreign governments get these objects back from the U.S.?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, because I didn't cover that so much, but in terms of what I've seen and what I've read and followed, the answer is yes. I think that there are a lot of organizations now who support that, at least also with the Holocaust era, who will help them, the Holocaust recovery, and the state. There's a New York, another society. There are a number of organizations now that help the countries locate their missing material. But UNESCO also led to the Red List. So there's always been a list of dealers out there that to watch out for, or objects
Yeah.
to look for, with the lootedart.com. Um, yeah. So I just
Museums are now, they're very good about transparency. They have websites. They're now carrying information about, questionable objects. Probably can't talk about some of them, but if it's on the website, it's public information, right? So you can. Um, but are there other websites that you'd like to mention that are really good for tracking some of this down, like the Chicago Art Institute? I understand has a good one. Boston has a good one. Are there others you want to mention?
Well, I would say the Met, for example, is a very good one. For example, they have a wonderful database of object labels from things that could relate to 19 between the 33 to 45 of modern labels. There's, I think, labels and marks are another key way to make sure you first know what you have. And then there's lootedart.com. There's the German portal, which allows you to search for Holocaust era objects that have been, you can post objects. Yeah, there is a lot out there. In fact, that's the thing. I mean, the last 4 years, there's been so much that's been art recovery. That's another one. Yeah,
Well,
I think UNESCO.
when you were at the Smithsonian, were you involved in any kind of exchanges with other countries or loan backs, or do museums ever try to purchase collections that when a host country, for instance, might have duplicates or they don't need it back, they might want the money instead? I mean, what happens in that situation? Do museums collaborate and work things out in ways that don't always involve taking the object back to the host country?
Yes, that was why I was mentioning that with the Gui, for example. They didn't go
Oh,
back, but that was a family.
uh,
In terms of the country, I think that was what happened with African art. This again predated me, but in my book, the then chief curator of African art wrote about that exact case where they said, we don't want the object back. We want to be trained in the museums. We'd rather have resources. We want to come to the Smithsonian. We want we want to be mentored, the next generation. So, while I was at the Smithsonian, we repatriated human remains. Again, no one remember Aboriginal remains to Australia. That was back in 2008 already when it was discovered. It was actually an archaeology dig that involved 3 different institutions. Um, I have to say the other website, I think the National Museum of American Indian, their repatriation team is phenomenal, in which, and this speaks to what you were saying. For example, there was a ceremonial hat in the collection. It was, and the tribe came and said, we don't really want it back, but we would like to do a ceremony to to almost sort of decommission it and transfer its power to another object. So the Smithsonian was able to create a wonderful 3D printed version of it that was identical. They came to the American Indian Museum, performed a ceremony, it was transferred over. And so now they know this object is safe. They can visit it anytime. There's a wonderful collection center for the American Indian. It's not at the museum. Anybody can make an appointment. And so the hat remains in the museum's collection, and they're happy to have their hat for their ceremony. So even they recognize that they couldn't care for it, and they wanted us to care for it, and they can have access to it, and they can use it. So there are many ceremonial objects that they come and sort of, like checking out of the library, which I think is great,
I'm
because
going to have another few questions for you about American Indian
yeah.
restitution when we get to NAGPRA. But
Oh, okay.
for the moment, I don't want to get too far along before we talk about the famous, or maybe I should say infamous, Colonel Matthew Bogdanos, who is the assistant to DA in Manhattan and created the head of Antiquities Traffic Unit, which, to my knowledge, is the only one in the world. Or do you know of any others? I don't
Well,
know.
I think Italy started one. I mean, they have one. The Carabinieri.
Okay.
Yeah, the Carabinieri
Okay.
have one, but again, that came about in maybe I was working on an ancient Roman art show around 2003, 2004, and so yeah, that. But
Well,
well, I
he seems greatly feared because he's taking objects from museums and from collectors and from galleries, but he does it with evidence. And he's been known to show up at the front door of a museum to confiscate objects.
yeah,
And he's impounded thousands of artifacts from New York galleries and museums. One of his famous cases is the one of Kapoor that resulted in the return of 192 stolen pieces valued at 3.4 million to Pakistan. That was a big one.
yeah,
And in 23 and 24, Bogdanos returned something like $80 million of stolen artifacts to Italy. That has been one of his. Italy is important to him.
yeah.
He's Greek, but his mother gave a copy of the Iliad when he was young, and he understood his Greek heritage and the antiquities. But my question about Bogdanos is that given his work has resulted in some 12 New York galleries coming down to about 3,
Mhm.
given that Sotheby's auction house is now doing their auctions, holding them in London, possibly to avoid Bogdanos, and given the fact that dealers continue to operate online or by appointment only, it seems like it's hard to avoid his subpoenas and search warrants. Is Bogdanos a friend or a foe to galleries, dealers, museums, and the public? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I followed his rise a bit, but more from another side because the Smithsonian, when I launched the Smithsonian Provenance Research Initiative under Richard Curran also launched the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative. So we were, that was the time when all of the antiquities was clear were coming after the Baghdad Museum had been looted. Corey Wagner was there, who was a curator from Minneapolis, was a army officer, museum trained, and so she tried to mitigate some of the things that happened. I mean, a little bit like his story, but Corey was a museum professional at that time already, so she's probably worked more closely with him. But we were training Homeland Security what to look for things coming over the border. Smithsonian was Corey's program was doing this. And so we've always worked closely with the Smithsonian. I still, as you know, Peggy, you go to the Smithsonian, and it's a royal we for everybody because it's the nation. So, so no, I don't think that there can be anything negative about what he's doing. I mean, he's getting a lot of media attention. I mean, if it just,
Yeah,
I hope,
I want
yeah,
to talk about one of the things that is not confidential because it was well in the press during the
yeah,
time it happened. But he got a tip about a looted mummy coffin whose corpse had been dumped in the Nile. So he went to the coffin's buyer, which unfortunately was the Met.
yeah,
Likely he went without the usual courtesies, according to New York's
yeah,
cultural institution. But he's not part of the Manhattan Antiquities establishment. He's a retired Marine colonel and an amateur middleweight boxer. So
yeah,
he's kind of a fascinating fellow in this field.
right,
He has military service, a law degree from Columbia. He's got a classics degree from Columbia. And in the case of the mummy coffin, a smuggler turned informant was in Dubai and called Bogdanos and told him about this. And he said basically that by the afternoon he had a grand jury opened to look into this.
yeah,
And the official summary says that the Met bought this golden first century BC coffin for about $4 million. And Bogdanos showed up with proof. And it's just amazing that there were 3 conflicting ownership histories, the involvement of known traffickers, a forged export license that bore the stamp Arab Republic of Egypt before the country even used that name. Smugglers had so hastily disposed of the coffin's occupant, an Egyptian priest, that the museum's conservators found a finger bone still inside the coffin. Bogdanos called this the ostrich defense. In other words, stick your head in a hole and ignore all the evidence. I think that was a moment ago, and I think museums are better now at recognizing what is going on, and that this couldn't happen today. I don't think it's happened a couple of decades ago,
yeah,
15 years ago. So,
yeah,
but but anyway, there's one more question that I want to ask you about the antiquities works, and that is the Steely that showed up at the Armory Show in New York. And Bogdanos and his team were scouring that. That show was there for about 5 days, I guess. And they had time and they went back, they finished their research, and they found that the stele, which had been in the collection of the Montreal Museum of Art, I believe, had been there since the 50s. They must have sold it at auction, but
Yeah.
it was up for sale again, and two dealers from Britain owned it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it means that from the 50s on, it had about 7 decades of provenance. But Bogdanos learned that it had been illegally excavated in Iran in the 1930s. So, how far back do we go given the 1970s UNESCO law? And does this mean that items in American museums can be taken even if acquired before 1970? Are standards being applied that didn't exist before?
Well, boy, you've raised it all. I mean, I mean, in the sense that that's where I think the shift away from just reading the legal recommendations and guidelines to be followed, that
Mm.
people are ethically responding to these, requests. Like maybe it's the 1970 doesn't apply, but this is so egregious, we need to return it. And I think museums now actually want to return things because they want to regain the public trust because they feel they've been beaten down, quite frankly.
But they do want proof, and that's why you pointed out that the Smithsonian brought legal in, because they want to make sure that whoever is claiming these objects, has the right to claim them. I agree. I think it's important. Um,
Yeah.
Jane, do you want to say anything about the auction houses and the galleries and collectors? How do they differ from the research and the repatriation of museums? They're in the same situation, basically.
Well, well, yeah, no. I mean, auction houses. They're turning things over at a faster rate generally than we are. They have some of their own. Christie's has a database. As you know, they have their own thing. I'd like to respond about a German auction house in Munich that we dealt with because Katrin Stoll, who was the head of Neumeister Auction House, which had been Weinmüller, which was a Aryanized auction house, so it was acquired. And when she took ownership, she knew of this history that predated her and her family's, and launched a whole thing on Holocaust era to research everything that had made everything transparent. Brought in an art history student, brought in the Munich art history department. Well, the reaction from the rest of the German auction houses was terror, because here was an auction house totally giving full open access to their past records. And not only that, doing even further, more careful provenance research, because they gained the trust of a lot of people in terms of turning their objects over and making sure that they turned every bit of information that they had over. So at first, none of the German auction houses were eager about that. I think she was a little ostracized for doing this great thing. And now about all of them have turned around, and you have things like in New York, the French auction house, uh, Wildenstein Plattner Institute now, which is actually, they digitized all of the gallery records that related to a lot of those early modernist sales. Those were not accessible before. So I think galleries and auction houses are collaborating more. I think they don't. I mean, I just think that no responsible curator acquiring anything these days would just rely on the provenance the auction house gives you, or the gallery. I mean, I don't know a single curator that would buy that. Back in 1990, when I was in Detroit, we didn't buy that because we knew because of how the collections were formed. So yeah.
If we migrate over to the museums, what's the role of museum trustees in the process of repatriation for museums? I mean, the museums represent the public trust, and deaccessioning is a major thing for museums. So what do the trustees think? I guess they take their cues primarily from the curators, the conservators, the directors.
Not really anymore. It used to be, as you know, the field has changed dramatically, Peggy. Some things are better. Some things I think are what are preventing museums from moving forward into the 21st century in a much more transparent way. I'm not talking about big institutions like the Met or Boston MFA, or even like Nelson Atkins, where you have demonstrated at every level that you'll do everything you can to make your collections transparent and accessible. Um, uh, there's this at the trustee level now. A number of people who collected, they're new collectors, and so some of them are more maverick than others, and they view, because again they're private institutions, and so they're the governance keepers. Again, at the Smithsonian, our trustees are appointed by the vice president and president. So we've got a whole group. We have we have business people, but things are sort of kept in check by our guidelines. So we're not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I do think it's a huge concern for these smaller museums because the expense, right? Sometimes I think I can't name it, but there was a museum that recently gave something back, and I think they just did it on their own. I mean, it's crazy.
That's
I'm
great.
sorry. You need to work with your own professional associations because you can't know everything that's going on all the time. And the more we connect and collaborate, let's
Yeah.
be transparent about it. So, what I wanted to say was this: that's where you saw the deaccessioning of collections. If we tell people we care for things in perpetuity, and now we're beginning to sell collections to fund exhibitions and other things, it's created a whole. It's a what do you call what's that shift in our a mesmeric shift? I can't think of it. An earthquake in a sense for that. And yeah, it's
So let us we've got about 12 minutes left. Let's move on to NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It seems to have stalled in recent years, and the U.S. government has raised the timing bar and updated last year the NAGPRA law that was originally created in 1990. And this caused quite a panic among many museums that have collections of the American Indian. And I'd like to talk a little bit about, NAGPRA is primarily for federal museums, correct? Who are funded totally by the government, or museums that receive grants from the government, like from NEA or NEH. They have to also return objects or come up with a plan, and money is available for a plan to come up with a plan, correct?
that's what I understand. Yeah.
What else do you want to tell us about NAGPRA? Because so many objects have been returned because of it, which is really great. I mean, it's been, 25 years. So
Right.
any more thoughts? You must have worked with NAGPRA at the Smithsonian, and you probably have worked with tribal members in whether it's education or programs, or what you can exhibit or what you can't exhibit. Do you want to talk a little bit about NAGPRA?
Yeah, well, even how we store it and where we store it, to what object we store it next to, and who can look at that object. No, I can't speak globally. I can only speak to the Smithsonian. It's a big department, and they're doing great work. In fact, a lot of people tended to think that George High, who was one of the biggest donors of the collection to the Smithsonian, we have the two museums. I don't know if people know this. We have a museum in New York, George High Center, and also the American Indian Museum in Washington. And it was during that time people always assumed that High had destroyed the archival records to these collections. Well, in my book, that one particular chapter, it was discovered, the records were discovered that they were separated from the collection. So when High was collecting, he was very much aware they were collecting to preserve what they thought was going to be completely lost, was this important culture by the Native American people. And so they discovered that the archives were separated, were given to some small college, I think in New York. I can't remember the details. Everybody should buy that book. I think it's a great book, our book. And now, so after being villainized for taking these things and accused of destroying documents, it turns out he saved every piece that he possibly could in relation to these objects. And now they're matching them up. They're still in the process of matching them up. So our graduate students from University of Glasgow have been interns in this program. And in terms of returns, they have a whole building, ceremonial spaces for these things. It's absolutely fabulous.
But when it comes to indigenous collections, such as those of the American Indian and the Australian Aboriginal, Alaskan, Hawaiian, early African, the collectors who collect these things, do you think it's morally reprehensible? I mean, are they moved by curiosity and a desire to understand other cultures? I mean, museums are to promote curiosity, which leads to knowledge, to tolerance, all the things we know and do and love, and eventually to acceptance. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on who collects these things, this material
Yeah.
culture, and why.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, interesting. Um, I think most collectors that I know, and I'm thinking of contemporary collectors, and I think that's how I began to approach provenance research, are exposed to an object they think is so amazing, they've never seen anything like it, and they're very curious about where it came from, who made it, and why they were struck by it. And it starts from there. So whether it be turned wood or Amazonian feathers or some Aboriginal painting, or they saw a TV show and they saw an object they never even knew that a functional object like that existed. It creates a kind of curiosity, and maybe there's a naivety about how some of them have gone about it. But I do think that in the past, we've the way galleries, the way art is sold has changed. So people are buying things online, right? And it has often has no provenance. These are small level things. So I think, collectors, when I think of some of the collectors at the Freer Sackler Gallery, for example, when we started our provenance project, when they realized they hadn't thought to themselves, oh my goodness, did I do due diligence to the provenance objects in my collection that they want to give to the museum? So we were encouraging them, before you bring it to us, you need to hire a provenance researcher to work with you. So I encourage anybody that wants to buy seriously, don't just buy a collection manager who's recording. Hire someone to do the research for you. Everything is very specialized these days. You cannot do it yourself. I think that's the one thing that, like I said about running the nuclear power plant. You have to respect people who actually are in the business of the arts, that you're hiring reputable people as well. I think a lot of appraisers rely on provenance research to help too. So.
I want to talk a little bit about the psyche of the American Indian and the history, because there's a great deal of disrespect that goes on. And I want our audience to know that there are some terrible stories from before. Do you remember the great anthropologist Franz Boas from the Museum of Natural History in New York? Well, back in the late 19th century, he arranged for a group of 6 Inuits from Greenland to come to New York and to enlighten them, meaning the curators at the museum, about their culture. And they soon got very bad colds. They tried their native healing methods, only to be ridiculed by the New York public. It turned out that they all had TB, and only 2 survived. One was a young boy, and he was told his father had been properly buried according to tribal custom. But he later found out that his father's body, he saw his father's body on exhibit in the museum. Um, these are some of the unhappy stories that exist, but some of the museums with unrepatriated remains include the Smithsonian, as we've mentioned, the American Museum of Natural History, as we've mentioned, the Peabody at Harvard, Indiana University, the Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley, which has 9,000 objects. In fact, California State University is said to have almost 700,000 remains on 21 of its campuses. Yet it happened in different times, but who is addressing all of this, and how long will it take to sort it out? It seems like it's going to go on forever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. It's a big job. I mean, and I think that you can't just hire a reporter staff to come and do it. I mean, I think was what we were seeing. Reporters go in for they think they spend 3 years. It can't be solved in 3 years. Can't be solved.
There's the NAGPRA thing was buoyed by a fabulous woman called Maria Pearson, she was considered the Rosa Parks of NAGPRA, but she was an early catalyst for NAGPRA. But it started when she went to the governor in Iowa, when she realized graves were uncovered, white people were properly interred in the ground again, and American Indians were sent to the research laboratories and to the museums. And the governor said, "What can I do for you?" The governor of Iowa. And she said, "You can give me back my people's bones and quit digging them up." And she succeeded in Iowa in 1976 when they created a protective state law, and then she went national with NAGPRA. So I think that, this is the kind of thing that really just started in the 70s and moved, late 70s, moved into the 80s, and then 1990, I think, was the original NAGPRA situation. But you know that in many of these things, the context was lost when people dig up things, because you'd think in the 1980s we should know better, but there's a story in Stockton, California in the 1980s where a developer was doing a commercial residential project, and 200 Miwok ancestral remains were found along with, material culture. And the descendants of the people wanted to preserve it as a cemetery, but the developer went to court, and the court said the developer could continue with the site, and the site was decimated. There were bones and artifacts. And this doesn't happen, I hope, anymore. But 1980 is not too far in arrears. And I just want to bring up that issue of disrespect, that this is such an important culture that museums respond to and that we respond to. And we collect for the reasons that you stated. And so I just think that it's an important piece of legislation that's going to make our museums better. And it also provides an opportunity for archaeologists, anthropologists, curators to work together on all of this. Jane, I have a question for you. From American colonial times forward, has America ever asked for an American painting or American furniture or decorative arts back from Europe or elsewhere? Has that ever happened, or is it only going the other way around?
Well, actually, in terms of Native American art, Germans were major collectors of this material early on, more than in America. So some of that did come back to the United States, but it wasn't repatriated. Not that I mean, it was deaccessioned and brought back, and then some of it then given back to the people through the Smithsonian. So there are instances of that, but
can't
specifically.
Well, thank you. I have one last question for Jane. Objects from other cultures are how we learn about other cultures. Can we do the right thing, yet not close our doors to the culture of other countries?
Yes, I think we can. And I think that's bringing people, objects, and places together. And I think I applaud what you're doing with this forum, because the more people are aware of the complexities and the options for finding out about what they collect, what they see, how to share these stories, is a way to move everything forward in a productive way.
Well, the Saint Helena Forum offers a huge thank you to you, Jane, for helping enlighten us on what a very important issue for the future of education, our children, and our world culture. And a thank you as well to our audience for being with us as we explored the current situation of repatriation and pondered our future with the material culture of the world. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jane and Peggy, thank you both so much for letting us listen in on your fascinating, really insightful conversation. If you'd like to read more about today's subject, consider buying a copy of Jane's book, Collecting in Provenance, A Multidisciplinary Approach, which you can find online in bookstores everywhere. And finally, thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today at our last presentation of 2024. It's been a joy to share our interviews with audiences from all over America and from 40 to 60 countries around the world. Our diverse subjects have ranged from documenting war crimes to the search for the beginnings of life in the universe to the surrounding controversy of deep sea mining. If you've missed any of our presentations, you can find them archived at shforum.org. I want to offer a special thank you to the members of our creative board, our advisory board, our research squad, and our technical producer. And finally, as we say goodbye, we'd also like to thank the following people for their generosity in making the Saint Helena Forum and its continuing programs possible.